multiple papers have been retracted from the lab, and just in terms of the practical numbers in general, like how much they increased in the hip thrust, their squat, the raw numbers in general, just what was going on was like super fishy.
But I think if people run with the idea that it's supposed to be a comparison of longer versus shorter muscle length training for the glutes, then you get into a pretty good place because of the limitations that we mentioned.
Welcome to the N1 Experience, brought to you by N1 Education, the leader in fitness education. Hey, what's up, everybody? Today I have two wannabe doctors with me today, actually, or a nice way of putting that is two future doctors, Milo Wolf and Daniel Plotkin, and we are going to be discussing glutes. Particularly, the discussion is going to revolve around the research that corresponds to hypertrophy, muscle lengths, and the new study that Daniel is the lead author on, comparing the hip thrust to the squat. So I think one of the reasons that this is such a popular topic, not only is it that the hip thrust has just always been one of those exercises that people have strong feelings about, and you could say the same thing for the squat. People tend to choose a camp of one over the other, and it's very, very hard to get people to, kind of take a, we'll say, middle of the road or a nuanced perspective. They're pretty much either going to be pro one or pro the other. And I think because of that popularity, there's been like more of a tribal response to any of the data that comes out, and there hasn't really been, much discussion. And when we have a limited amount of data, I think it fuels those conversations to be even more tribal. So hopefully we can kind of take a more objective look at both the most recent study and the evidence as a whole. And I think maybe kind of guide people to some objective training suggestions rather than the tribal, because I know a lot of people are going to take whatever evidence is presented and try and spin it towards their biases. And I saw that immediately happen. I knew that when this study was going to be released, that basically whatever you believed before, you were going to find a way to argue this in some way or shape for that. So I think this will be a good one for anybody that wants a very objective view of both this most recent study and glute training as a whole, and also expanding on the long muscle length training conversation that we have been having. So to start off, I'm going to let Milo introduce and summarize probably the study that I would say is the most direct in terms of comparing range of motion, which is right in his wheelhouse. So I will pass the torch to you.
Thank you for that. So the study I'm about to talk about is actually the only one that has compared training at different muscle lengths or using different ranges of motion on glute hypertrophy directly. Specifically, the study I'm talking about is by Kubo and colleagues from 2018, I believe, where essentially they had one same program for both groups. One group trained the squat exercise going only down to about 90 degrees of knee flexion. Now, how they control range of motion is relatively unknown, so it might be sort of visually 90 degrees of knee flexion. So that would be probably around parallel or slightly above parallel for most people, is what I would say. Compare that to a group training their squats going to 140 degrees of knee flexion. So a 50-degree difference in knee flexion, and 140 degrees, in my experience, would probably be pretty substantially below parallel, or at the very least convincingly below parallel. So kind of comparing a slightly above parallel squat to a substantially below parallel squat. And what they measured was a variety of things. They measured several muscle groups hypertrophy. They used MRI, if I'm not mistaken. And what they looked at was quad hypertrophy, so several heads of the quads. They looked at hamstring hypertrophy, and they looked at adductor and glute hypertrophy. Specifically, they looked at the gluteus maximus hypertrophy. They looked at the vastus lateralis for the quads, the vastus intermedius, the rectus femoris, and the vastus medialis. For the hamstrings, they also looked at all four heads. So they looked at a lot of muscle groups. What they found, briefly, is that the group training with deeper squats, so about 140 degrees of knee flexion at the bottom, saw the same roughly quad hypertrophy as the group training shallower squats, but saw substantially more adductor and gluteus maximus hypertrophy than the group doing half squats. Interestingly, for the hamstrings, no differences between groups, and importantly, no real hypertrophy of the hamstrings to begin with, which is kind of what we expect actually, because the squat doesn't train the hamstrings very well because it both extends the knee and extends the hips. So that's kind of shortening the quads at the knee, but lengthening them, shortening the hamstrings at the knee, actually the opposite. Shortening the hamstrings at the hip, but lengthening them at the knee, which then results in them not being able to contribute to the movement all that much. So not much hamstring hypertrophy, the same quad hypertrophy in both groups, but substantially more adductor hypertrophy and gluteus maximus hypertrophy when squatting a little bit deeper in parallel compared to a little bit above parallel. That's broadly speaking what the results were. Interestingly, as I mentioned, that's the only study looking at glute hypertrophy following training at different muscle lengths or training with different ranges of motion. There is always going to be the confounder in the study of, is there something about doing more range of motion? Maybe like just going through more range of motion itself is what resulted in more hypertrophy rather than training at longer muscle lengths on average. Now, in all likelihood, that's not likely to be a big confounder. The data overall suggests that it's mostly about the muscle length being trained rather than the simple act of going through more range of motion. So I think it is, broadly speaking, the only comparison we have of shorter and longer muscle length training for glute hypertrophy. So this is why the study by Plotkin and colleagues is actually really important. And that's why I'm really happy to have Daniel on call today to be able to hear his interpretation of the results, because I think that it's a super interesting topic. There's been a lot of hypothesizing and speculation on social media about whether or not certain muscle groups respond to longer muscle length training and greater hypertrophy, why they may or may not. And the glutes were definitely one of those muscle groups. What I've seen several people around social media saying they may or may not respond before the study. And so this study is kind of the second study in this line of research to talk about how the muscle length being trained impacts glute hypertrophy. And it's actually the first, let's say, real study looking at the adaptations following hip thrust exercising. So it's also interesting to have a study looking at how much muscle does the hip thrust itself grow, does it even grow appreciable muscle, and so forth.
All right, so Daniel, you had some comments on the Kubo, or some question studies on the Kubo study, right?
Yeah, so I'm just not sure that the limb angles are able to tell us too much about what exactly the squat looked like. So your summary was that it was a little bit above parallel for the 90 group, but you could imagine that it could have been a decent amount above parallel, femur parallel to the floor, or actually even a bit lower if you allow for the torso angle to be super, super deep. So it's just hard to know exactly what the squat looked like. So yeah, that's a limitation that I wish we could reach out to the authors and sort of get shed some light on that.
Yeah, and interestingly, there'll be some variance, right? Like for some people, 90 degrees of knee flexion might involve a lot of hip flexion too. Like as Kassem said earlier, Lane Norton squatting, 90 degrees of knee flexion might correspond to pretty much maximally lengthening the glutes max, just because of how much forward bend there is and how much hip flexion is involved. Whereas for some people it may not. I think the best we can do is kind of compare it to some biomechanical analyses of the squat exercise. We can kind of see, okay, well, 90 degrees might be around this much hip flexion, right? What we can say is that the full squat condition in that study definitely had longer muscle lengths, but it's difficult to say exactly what positions they were in, for sure.
Yeah. The main gripe I have is that people who are telling me that the difference between femur parallel to the floor and an ass to grass squat is exactly what they were looking at, and that's why I should have made sure that all of my participants were going ass to grass, because we know for a fact that that produces more glute hypertrophy. That's where I sort of don't see that line of reasoning to make sense. I think that's still an open question, and I think you can make an argument either way to how you would have them do things. Like, for example, how much true hip flexion do we have? Like, how much is the glute lengthen? And if you get some posterior pelvic tilt, you could actually make a decent argument the other way to like, oh, what's going on with the nervous system in that context and so on. So I don't think it's as clear cut as people are making it out to be.
I think there's a limitation in this in terms of the range of motion, but I think the study that you did is going to have some of those same limitations in that hip flexion is not what was standardized for. And if we're talking about glutes, we should probably be standardizing for the joint that the glutes act on. If the question we were asking is, hey, what about how is the range of motion at the hip impacting the glutes, then we should standardize the squat for hip flexion range of motion, not standardizing it for the knee or just depth. Because same thing, like femur parallel, right, or below parallel, or even just ass to grass squat can still result in a variety of hip angles amongst individuals. So, what I would look at is if I really wanted to see what is the potential for the glutes in the squat, would be how do we set this up so that the participants are maximizing both the hip torque and the hip flexion. And so they're basically doing the most hip and glute biased version of the squat for their structure. And we could do some sort of range of motion testing to see what is a reasonable hip flexion, and then have that be like, okay, can we, cue the participants to kind of lead with driving their hips back and get then everybody getting into basically a full hip flexion, but also having a greater moment at the hip. Because that would be a squat that you would do specific to this. Whereas I think probably what you did is you were just, hey, whatever squat somebody kind of just naturally falls into compared to the hip thrust, but not what is the way that you would squat if you were squatting for glutes. And I think that's when we get to your study, that'll be an interesting conversation of where we think this may or may not have influenced the results if we actually did the squat to try and be as favorable as possible for glute hypertrophy versus we just kind of set up a squat for what is, we'll say, a standard or balanced type of squat. All right. Anything else on the Kubo one? So I think the pros that we have going for it is it is the most direct comparison of range of motion that we have. It's just the range of motion is kind of ambiguous, but we can probably at least assume that on average, the half squat group didn't do as much flexion as the full squat group. We just don't have a lot of granular data on how much, that of a difference there really would have been between the groups.
Yeah, for sure. And the one thing I'd note on finally is that it is a pretty internally valid comparison of longer and shorter muscle length training, and that they use the same exercise, right? So there is going to be differences in the ranges of motion involved in potentially the contribution of the different hip extensors and so forth, but it does minimize confounding of the effect of different exercises on hypertrophy outcomes potentially. So it is a reasonably robust comparison of shorter and longer muscle length training on hypertrophy. That's kind of the final thing I'd say about this study specifically. But I'd love to go into Daniel's study now, because I think that adds a lot of data to the picture.
I'm just going to sum up the Kassiano study really quick, just so that we have basically the two other pieces of evidence that we have that are somewhat relative, and then we'll jump into it. So the Kassiano study that looked at basically one group doing leg press and an RDL, or I believe they've referred to it as a stiff leg deadlift. And then they had another group also doing those two exercises, but then they also added the hip thrust on top of that. And what they found is that by adding the hip thrust, there was a substantial increase in hypertrophy, but also we have to consider that they basically increased the training volume by about 50%, right? By adding the hip thrust. So you can't really separate that out. We don't know, what would have happened if they would have just done, because they were doing two sets of 15 to, I think it was momentary failure actually in that study, not volitional, which is nice. But they were doing 2 sets basically of each exercise. So in the group of 2 exercises, they were doing 4 sets twice a week. And then the other group, they were doing 6 sets twice a week. And, a 50% volume jump, yeah, I think we would expect to see an increase in hypertrophy by just doing that. But if you wanted to lean in the favor of the hip thrust, you could argue that it was a pretty substantial increase by adding the hip thrust. It wasn't just a marginal, it was a substantial amount. But again, the technique and the form and the setup of these exercises comes into play. And so in the resource material, you can see that the leg press they did would basically be kind of a balanced leg press of okay, it's going to be quads and glutes. It's not a foot high, trying to leverage the torque at the hip. And their stiff-legged deadlift is obviously going to be, length is going to be limited by the hamstring still in that. So I think what's going to be interesting as we get into your study and we talk about this as a whole is muscle length is a factor, but specificity is going to be a big factor, right? I mean, there is still the whole neuromechanical matching thing to consider. There is the whole, how well does this align actually with that muscle's function? And then there is where does this muscle exist in the synergist role of, this movement and all of the muscles that act on that? And is it actually going to be the limiter of the exercises, or are these other exercises being limited? So in this study, were the glutes not actually, like, even though the exercises were being taken to momentary muscular failure, from a physiological standpoint, were there reps in the tank for the glutes in both of those exercises? Because maybe the quads were still the limiter in the leg press and the hamstrings were still the limiter in the stiff-legged deadlift. So then a specific exercise allows us to take the glutes basically closer to, a physiological failure without being limited by the exercises like point of failure, because another primary muscle group is actually what really kind of ends the set for us, right? So any comments you guys have on that one in addition to?
Yeah, I think one interesting thing to think about when it comes to like longer versus shorter muscle lengths is that if, and this is sort of a big if, they have different mechanistic pathways, is there a capping effect? And can you reach that capping effect more quickly with longer muscle lengths and there won't be any cherry on top with shorter muscle lengths? Or do you have different mechanistic pathways where, let's say this study did a higher amount of sets of each exercise and then added the hip thrust, so lengthened exercises, and then added the hip thrust, would we see a different outcome? I find that really interesting. So I think potentially future research can look at, all right, what are the additive roles of the different along the length tension curve?
Yeah. So real quick, we do actually have some direct evidence on this and not on the mechanism, which I actually fully agree with you. In the future, we need more data on that because otherwise it's difficult to understand all this stuff. But we do have some data specifically from Pedrosa and colleagues using the leg extension exercise, where they had 4 conditions. So they assigned people's legs to one of 4 conditions. One condition was doing all of their leg extensions with the forerange of motion. One condition was doing all their leg extensions with the bottom half, so lengthened partials. One condition was only doing the top half, so shortened partials. And one condition was doing half their volume in the bottom half and half of it in the top half. So with the condition doing half their volume in the bottom half and half of it in the top half, if there was a cap to the benefit of lengthened training, you would expect that group did just as well or better if there's kind of an additive effect of shortened training than the lengthened partial only group. But actually you kind of saw the opposite, where for 3 of the 4 sites measured for the quads, the combined group, so half the volume in the bottom half, half of it in the top half, did as well as a lengthened partial group. But then for 1 of the 4 sites, the lengthened partial group did outperform the combination group. So if anything, you kind of see the opposite, where, at least in that study, there was no cap to lengthened partial training being beneficial, and there was no additive effect of shortened partials being added. If anything, there was still a benefit of doing more lengthened partials rather than adding in shortened partials.
Yeah.
Now, I'll admit, it was 1 exercise. It could very well be the case that if you did 2 exercises lengthened partials, at that point you'd hit that cap, and by adding in shortened work, you'd get additional hypertrophy through other mechanisms. But I think for the time being, it's an interesting concept, and you could argue that based on anecdotes of people doing a variety of exercises, seeing more hypertrophy in practice or some of that stuff, that there can be a case made for it. But the direct data on it doesn't seem to pan out just yet. Could just be a case of absence of evidence rather than evidence of absence, though.
Yeah, I definitely think there's an absence of evidence because in this specific case, there's matched volumes, right? So we're not talking about adding additional shortened and also just the volumes in general. So higher volumes themselves could have lent themselves to different results. So if there is a capping effect, did they reach that capping effect for the mechanism if there is a separate mechanism for the length question? And then, so yeah, I definitely agree that we have no idea, but it's just an interesting concept. And I do wonder from a fatigue standpoint too, like whether people can tolerate more in the shortened position as the cherry on top. So something we can definitely get into. And I think it sort of lends itself to why I made some decisions about set volume in my study too.
I know our focus is on hypertrophy, but I love that Pedrosa study because the other marker that they measured was strength. And it appeared that by doing the variation group of half the partials lengthened, half the partials shortened, they were able to outperform all of the groups on strength, right? So it may be that, like, if you're doing mostly lengthened, to get basically the strength benefits across the full range, you only need a small bit of shortened work. And then the other thing, and this is something that I've at least been putting into in practice for a long time, both with range of motion and resistance profiles, is instead of choosing to like just try and make every exercise as much range as possible and have a resistance challenge the whole way, is I've found, especially in physique athletes, that I've seen better results kind of actually just breaking those two things up, like having their lengthened work not being limited by fatigue in the mid to short, and then having their short work being very specific to that. And then being able to like basically play around with the volumes of that for an individual independently, right? But I have seen very good progress anecdotally separating that out versus just trying to rely on trying to make every exercise, say, a full range of motion challenge. So I don't know if you guys have played around with that or have any anecdotes or whatnot, but I believe maybe there's a possibility for that in there. But yes, evidence definitely lacking, but I think it's fun to think about. So, all right. If we don't have any more,
I was just going to say, it's not just the Pedrosa study with regards to the strength outcomes there. There's about 5 studies comparing, say, doing just full range of motion to doing full range of motion and a partial range of motion, or to doing 2 different types of partial range of motion. Generally, combining different ranges of motion seems to lead to similar or better strength outcomes in full range of motion strength than just doing full range of motion. It's a growing body of evidence, but there's about 5 studies now, and it seems pretty consistently the case that it's at least as good or potentially better, which, as an aside, kind of lends credibility to the idea for powerlifters, for example, or strongmen, of doing some specific training, like as in mostly to powerlifting standards or weightlifting standards or what have you, but also potentially the inclusion of some partial range of motion training as a means to further increase their maximum strength.
Cool. All right. So with that, I think we'll transition into your study, Daniel. But I think it's worth mentioning that this, well, I don't know, depending on how you look at it, this is or is not the first study comparing the squats versus the hip thrust. There is the infamous Barbalho study that came out, I believe, in 2020 that compared, or was supposed to compare, depending on how you look at it, the squat and the hip thrust. And they found that the squat was superior to this, but basically what has happened is there's been some serious questions into the validity of that study and whether or not that data is actually representative or if it was all out fraud. And it seems to be that the consensus from a lot of people in the evidence-based community is they have very low confidence in that study, to say the very least. And maybe I'm being charitable, maybe I'm not. I am not a deep, statistics guy. So I've read the white paper that was published, to as much of it as I could stay awake for. But I think it's fair to say that, the work that you guys had a better design, but I would say that the one thing that's going to separate this, and then we can kind of address this as you're going through, is that if you were to be on the side that you think that study was legit, the major difference would have been, one, you guys had a better measurement system, but they used like what arguably was very well-trained subjects, right? Like basically like one of the most trained populations we've seen in a study, if that were the case. And I think that's going to be at least a topic to address of why you guys chose what you did and whether or not we think that changing the population would make a difference. So if you want to throw any comments in about, the previous study as you kind of introduce yours, you can go ahead and do that and then kind of walk us through your study.
Yeah. Do you want me to go through how my study sort of came to be, or do you want me to first go through like the details of the study and then we can circle back? How do you want me to go about it?
I think people will at least be interested in the cliff notes of how it came to be,
Okay,
right?
cool.
Because I do think it's interesting that we're in a state now where there are social influences into what research is being done and also then kind of how it's being interpreted and whatnot. And I know that's going to be one of the criticisms that's thrown out. And so I think as much transparency there is useful.
Okay, cool. So just briefly to talk about the Barbalho study and the Gentile lab in general, it's very clear that multiple papers have been retracted from the lab, and just in terms of the practical numbers in general, like how much they increased in the hip thrust, their squat, the raw numbers in general, just what was going on was like super fishy. Like I think that's why they decided to look at it in a more robust statistical fashion, because it just screamed there's some issues here. If they used numbers that made a little bit more sense, then I don't think there would have been this level of scrutiny. But then paper after paper started to show that there were issues. So I think we can say with pretty good confidence that there's some nefarious activity going on there and that the study probably hadn't occurred. I have no ill will toward any of those parties at all. I just, that's just where the evidence leads. So with that being said, that's part of the reason why this study was hip thrust versus squat and not a more isolated glute question, because that study drew a lot of attention and many people wanted to see, what would actually be the outcome if the study was run appropriately. So it's actually kind of funny. One grad student in my lab wanted to run a study. He's interested in protein folding and protein breakdown and things like that. And he wanted to run a study which was essentially comparing some sort of incline walk to interval training with resistance training and look at different molecular markers. So we wanted to elicit funding from Brett for that. So he was one of the potential funders. And Brett listened to the whole spiel and he was like, basically, long story short, cool story, let's run a glute study. So totally did not care for that specific design. So he essentially tasked me with drawing up what I would consider to be a good comparison. We went back and forth with RDL and elevated lunges. And in the end, with my master's professor, Brad Schoenfeld's input and his input, we decided that we wanted to answer a more popular practical question rather than isolate the glute question. So yeah, I think that's how the study came to be. Any questions on that? Oh, and in terms of funding, it was very, very cool. So initially, Brett was going to fund the whole study, but with talking with Menno Henselmans, they came to the agreement that they would split it. And so, yeah, super cool that they're willing to, part with their own money and a significant amount of money to, answer hard questions that actually question their long-held beliefs, especially in the case of Brett. I don't think Menno had a horse in the race. So, yeah. So in terms of the design, we recruited untrained individuals from the university population, ranging from undergrads to grad students. And we started with 39 participants, and then it dwindled down to 35 before the initial MRI, just scheduling issues. And then during the course of the study, there was only one dropout in the squat group that was unrelated to the squat. She just got very sick. So we ended with 18 participants, 13 females, 5 males in the hip thrust group, and 16 participants, 10 females, 6 males in the squat group. And in terms of what they did, we randomized them to either squat alone or hip thrust alone. And sets were to volitional failure, so when they believed they couldn't do another rep with good form. And they did 3 sets for the first week. It was 9 weeks total. 3 sets for the first week, 4 sets for the second week. For the 3rd through 6th week, they did 5 sets. And for the 7th through 9th week, they did 6 sets. And for pre and post testing, we used MRI to measure hypertrophy. And we did 3 strength tests. We did the standing wall push, which I would refer you to the paper for you to see the exercise. It's kind of hard to describe. And we did a squat 3RM, a hip thrust 3RM, and a deadlift 3RM in that order. And shall I go into some outcomes? Yeah. Okay, perfect. So for hypertrophy, we found that both groups have hypertrophied a whole lot in the glute. So upper glute, middle glute, and lower glute. But we found for both groups, the lower glute grew more, but there were no differences between groups for any of the glute hypertrophy measures specifically. But for the squat group, they increased more in the adductor and more in the quad. And they did not hypertrophy in either group meaningfully in the glute med, the glute min, or the hamstring. So I think the main takeaways from the study are, 1, if you want to hypertrophy the glute mean and glute med, then you probably want to do some abduction work to stimulate those muscle groups. That makes a whole lot of sense to me. The other outcome is that when comparing these two specific exercises, there is no difference in gluteal hypertrophy, and it sort of corroborates other evidence that the hamstring is not hypertrophied. And if you want more overall growth and you don't want to limit growth to the glute, then obviously squats are a good idea because the adductor and the quad grew more in the squat group. I think I covered most everything. Yeah.
Milo, I'll let you go ahead and ask your questions and make your comments first.
Sure. So first of all, very cool study. I think that I guess one question I had out of curiosity is, how is the funding used exactly?
Yeah, so 500 per participant was the payment. So we had
that's a lot of money.
It's a good chunk of change. So that's why a lot of this was on a time crunch. So IRB issues and just like dealing with the MRI, like it's a separate building and a separate group of people that we have to. So like doing all that stuff is no easy task, coordinating all of it. So yeah, 500 per participant, and then the rest is MRI, and it's very expensive. I believe 600 an hour or something like that. Like it's very, very expensive. So most of the money went to MRI, and a good chunk of change went to paying the participants. So that's how that was broken down. We did have some extra left over because we wanted to recruit more, but as I mentioned, initially we recruited 40, and then like before the initial MRI, a bunch of people were like, oh, don't have the time. Luckily, we still ended up with pretty even groups, so it was all good.
And how much did you get to keep to make sure that the squat doesn't kick the crap out of the hip thrust?
Unfortunately, I make exactly $0, and I'm a grad student who's on a measly stipend. But yeah, those insinuations are always fun.
Man, at least you have a stipend. I did my PhD self-funded. You feel me?
Oh,
no stipend, and I paid. So hey, so that's labor of love right here.
Yeah, that's bad.
So I'm gonna ask a couple questions, and I think Kassem will have very different questions from mine, so that's why I'm not really touching on what I think he'll ask. One question and then a follow-up question I'll probably ask is, I saw the variance of measurement or the gluteus maximus measurements, like the confidence intervals, for example, are way larger than, say, the adductor, quad, or hamstring. Do you think that potentially the variance involved with measuring the glute max may have led to you being unable to detect differences with a sample size of maybe like 18 people per group roughly? Or do you think that it's a true effect, and it's a true positive, it's a true negative effect of there being no difference between the squat and hip thrust for glute max hypertrophy? Or to what extent do you think it's likely to be a false positive, and to what extent do you think it's likely to be a true positive? And what would you kind of identify as causes of it being one or the other?
Yeah, so I don't think the confidence intervals are particularly large, but it was larger than the thigh musculature, so that is true. I'm pretty confident that it's not a false positive, but there's always risk there. There's also the fact that the delineations between muscles for the quadriceps are much more obvious. I don't know if you guys ever dealt with MRI imaging for any muscle, but certain muscles are much more evident than others. So I would imagine that the variation probably ended up washing out in terms of between groups. But yeah, I mean, there's always going to be limitations, and I think particularly in the glute, a lot of the time it's just with ultrasound it's even worse. But even with MRI, the delineations are going to be somewhat unclear. More clear in the lower glute, like super clear, like I'm very confident. Mid was pretty good, but some gray areas sometimes, but usually very confident. And in the upper, there was a little bit more gray area with like where is the glute med and where is the glute max, but most of the time it was pretty clear. So I'm very confident in the validity of the results, but there's always some gray area when you're talking about identifying muscle tissue on an MRI.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So that's certainly been my experience with ultrasound as well, where I think that it was also like I didn't notice And to be honest, this could just be my naivety to MRI stuff. But then I noticed that there wasn't any reliability measurement for the MRI measurements, like either by the lab or for glute specifically or for the muscles measured. So it's just a question that I kind of had, but that makes sense. I think ultimately with anything, when we have one study on a topic with relatively small differences expected, like to give you some context, in my meta-analysis on range of motion and muscle length, the magnitude of effect of say training at longer muscle lengths versus shorter muscle lengths is like 5 to 10%, right? So that's a small difference. Across, say, the duration of this training intervention, with some variance, that's normal with measuring the glutes, for example, where it's difficult to distinguish, delineate different muscle groups. I'm just not sure that one study will be sufficient to give us a good answer, right? But that's to be expected. That's not like a slight on the study or on the authors at all. So I'd be interested to see, like, maybe in a few studies' time, comparing the hip thrust to lower muscle length training, what have you, we find out that there is a difference in favor of the hip thrust or in favor of lengthened training. But I just want to sort of point that out. Again, not as a slight on study at all. I understand how it is.
Yeah, for sure. I think one study in general, like even when you look at probability distributions, like you are going to get false positives. So there's taking one study and running with it is always a bad idea. So I'm totally in agreement there.
That's cool. That was most of what I had in mind off the top of my head, because I kind of read through the paper and I think there's a lot of things that Kassem will ask about. So I'll kind of leave it to Kassem for now.
Cool. So I think one of the probably the most pertinent question is around whether or not you thought that this study is, we'll say, a good answer or a good investigation into the muscle length question, because I know that was one of the first kind of interpretations that people took. And in reading the paper a second time, I will say that I can see reading the paper, because it's mentioned several times in the paper, that if you're going in looking for that answer, you're going to assume, like, to me, it would be very easy if I wanted this to make those conclusions, that reading the paper would make me think that, okay, yeah, this is one of the questions that, I mean, I don't write publications or whatnot, so I'm not trying to be critical or whatnot, but I'm just saying that, like, okay, I can understand a little bit more how people are kind of jumping to that conclusion, reading the paper a second time and actually just kind of paying attention to the language versus me just using my brain and looking at the methodology and being like, what do I think that, this study is good? And then we've had then subsequent conversations and interactions on Instagram where I think we're more on the same page. So I guess my first question is, do you think that this study, the way that you set it up, was, very insightful towards answering that question, right? And if so, like, where do you think that this study then sits relative to the other evidence that we have?
Yeah, so one, I want to push back a little bit. The amount of people that actually read the paper, I'm questioning whether, I don't know that they're coming from reading the paper and then believing it's a length question, when I doubt a lot of the people that were coming at the issue were actually doing it from the reading. But I'm just kind of saying that tongue-in-cheek. But in terms of whether I think we isolated the length question, I don't think that this design isolates it well. I think it could have isolated it better, and we didn't really design it to do that. It is more of a squat versus hip thrust question. At the bottom of the squat, the synergists involved and the limiters involved make it so that it's possible that the amount of nervous system excitation or activation wasn't enough to sort of answer that question for the glute. There's also the issue of the fact that the resistance curves are different. So it's more of a constant resistance curve in the hip thrust, where there is a drop off, but it's much less of a drop off than there is in the squat. So there's the issue of the fact that it's a totally different exercise. But I wouldn't totally dismiss it as not being insightful at all toward the length question, because if the squat had come out on top by a large margin, then we would probably say, like, length probably matters so much that synergists don't matter and all of this other context doesn't matter. So I think that you can have a middle of the ground interpretation where you can say it clearly didn't isolate the question, but if length was the only thing that mattered or the largest thing by a long shot, then you would expect the squat to come out on top. I think that's a fair interpretation without a ton of bias.
Yeah, I think a lot of people had questions on what the other confounders between the exercises are, right? And as you mentioned, they have different resistance profiles, but we're also comparing essentially a multi-joint compound exercise to a much more isolated exercise. Like a hip thrust isn't a completely single joint exercise, but it's much more isolated to the hip than a squat is. And, without trying to upset the mechanics nerds here, the hip thrust is going to be more closed chain relative to the squat, right? And there's debate about open and closed chains, different planes, et cetera, whatnot. But with the squat, like I think from my end, for people that aren't so much familiar with how the mechanics play into these things, is squat you have to balance, right? So the amount of muscle participation is limited by the fact that you can't just fall over during the exercise. So like it's if you just put a bunch of stem on somebody's glutes, and at the bottom of the squat you just shot a huge charge into their glutes, they would just fall backwards, right? They would hip extend and then they would end up on their back. So the fact that an exercise has to be balanced means that the contraction of certain muscles has to be throttled so that you don't fall over, right? And so that's an increased nervous system demand in terms of coordinating those exercises, which we have a lot of evidence showing that the more coordination demand there is in exercise, the less absolute motor recruitment we get in any single individual muscle. But then we have the fact that amongst different muscles, the amount that you can engage, or the amount of tension that a muscle can have, is relative to keeping you balanced in that squat. So that's one of the reasons where I think that if we wanted to compare a glute by a squat, we would want to minimize those things as much as possible by actually choosing a squat that was standardized to hip flexion and having people try and place as much torque at the hip relative to the knee, et cetera, because you're not going to be able to completely remove those things, but you're at least going to reduce how much those variables are, coming into play relative to, say, the muscle length question. But you had mentioned that originally you wanted to use an RDL, which would be more biased to the hip than the squat. But I think, and I mean, this is my opinion, and I actually, for whatever reason, I think I saw on Brett's Instagram that he doesn't like this one. But I think that the best way, if you wanted to answer this question on principle, would be to use something like a multi-hip that has almost no skill, and then you could easily just do it as a shortened and lengthened, partial. You could basically mimic the Pedrosa study, which is what I would like to see in something like that. And it wouldn't be very hard, especially if you're working with an untrained population, to have a multi-hip setup that's going to have adequate load and stability, I think, for the population. So I think if we really wanted to answer the question, that's kind of the design that I was thinking. I see Milo wanting to say something, so I'm just going to shut up for a second.
Yeah, so there's a couple things I'd say. As you mentioned, there's going to be confounders when comparing two different exercises. Another one I can think of that might be salient here is in the squat, different muscle groups for different joint functions even can give out before other ones, right? In this case, with a squat, you very much have a pretty heavy quadriceps involvement, especially with deeper squats. So it could be the case that, in the squat exercise, on average, quadriceps reached failure, let's call it first, and the glutes were still a few reps shy of failure, whereas in the hip thrust, it's more localized to the glutes. And so if you see some of the recent data, especially around how close to failure you train and how that impacts hypertrophy, it might be the case that simply a difference in how close to failure were the glutes by the end of the set in the squat versus the hip thrust, that alone could have a way larger impact than the impact of muscle length being trained. Just because, the effect size associated with training at longer lengths, shorter lengths, are actually quite a bit smaller than the effect size associated with training, say, 4 reps shy of failure, potentially, or 5, and training to failure. So that sort of confounder could alone influence the results a lot more than muscle length, and that's why, as you said, this study wasn't a perfect way to investigate the problem. And it actually brings me to a discussion I had earlier today with Brad Schoenfeld and a potential PhD student, where Brad kind of agreed with the line of reasoning we're engaging in right now, and we kind of came to the conclusion that one way for even Brett, for example, to be interested in a study on glutes looking at lengthened work with shortened work would be to compare the bottom half of the hip thrust to the top half, because that's still looking at the hip thrust, fundamentally, but it would be a relatively ecologically valid way of examining, do the glutes respond to relatively more lengthened or relatively more shortened training. Now, obviously, you'd have to account for the load because you can lift a lot more at the bottom of the thrust than the top, but that would be a way to look at it as well. Just wanted to put that in there. I think you can argue that neuromechanical matching also plays a role, and that's kind of tied into muscle length fundamentally, because like with the hips and the the glutes and the adductors, you can't train the glutes at long muscle lengths without also having the adductors have better leverage potentially. Like that's kind of the nature of the beast, to an extent. So I think the contribution and how close to failure, for example, the quads versus the glutes were in the squat in this study might be on the compounder.
Yeah, I think not being able to truly isolate the glute is a really good point. Like there's a ton of exercises and a ton of lengthened partial and just lengthened research in general that's looking at essentially, one joint and looking at where we know for sure one muscle is working or one muscle is the prime mover, while in pretty much every case, I think you can do a much better job of isolating, and I think the multi-hip would probably do a better job because there's still some quad involvement at the bottom of the thrust. Also, I feel extremely bad so I was loading the plates for the individuals, and they were getting really strong. Loading the plates for a partial at the bottom would just be an absolute nightmare. So I think the multi-hip might be a little bit more just friendly toward the actual researchers as well, plus the quad question and such. But yeah, you had something to say on that?
Plus, with a multi-hip, I mean, this is kind of just running in that direction now. We don't have to go there. But you could do single leg training a lot easier and have it within participant design.
Yeah, so that's the thing I was going to give. Yeah. For sure, yeah. So I strongly favor, like, anytime I can do a within subject design, I would want to do it. So yeah, I think we're in total agreement on that.
So I think this is a good place to kind of talk a little bit about the setups and the techniques that you use for the exercise. Let's start with the thrust because there's just fewer things. In the paper, you had your tempo listed in there. I believe it was a 2010 tempo, so 2 second eccentric, 1 second concentric, and no pauses at the top or the bottom, right? Now, how strict was that 1 second on the hip thrust? Were you actually having people kind of like go up slowly, so it was like a 1/1000, or were they thrusting as This is always one of my critiques of like the bridge versus thrust. I'm like, well, thrust implies they thrust, and the bridge requires kind of a controlled hold.
I think in the paper we say that it corresponded to 1 second, but we asked them to do an explosive thrust. So it wasn't 1 second. It could have been less than a second. We just wanted an explosive concentric and a controlled eccentric. Yep.
So that's where this is very interesting, because if you look at the resistance profile of a thrust and you base it off of static positions, it appears that it's a more balanced challenge, like throughout, with a small drop off. But if you're actually doing that, well, then momentum just takes over that, right? So basically, the resistance challenge on the concentric is all actually in the lengthened position of the thrust, right? Because momentum is basically deloading the top position. That's kind of like, that's a huge difference between doing a slower motion hip extension in like a bridgey type motion versus a thrusty type motion, right? Is basically you're flipping the resistance challenge in those instances. So in that instance, we're not really comparing we'll say a short challenge, where really it's like, well, we were comparing a shorter range of motion, but the resistance challenge would have peaked at the bottom of the thrust, at least on the concentric for sure on this, right? And that if they were doing a discipline like 2 second coming down, well, then obviously that profile would get a little bit closer to the static profile, but still, you guys were letting them come down till the plates touch the floor, right? So, yes. I mean, and that's a whole other element right there, right? Is that you actually do have a deloading period in this exercise where you and it's at the bottom, whereas at the squat you have a stack, but it's not like you don't get to take the bar off your back, but you basically unloading the joint. So that's another variable in there.
So one small thing on so we did want them to squeeze at the end. So there was a slight pause at the end for almost every rep. So I think saying that the top was deloaded would only be the case if they just sort of dropped sort of right back into the eccentric phase. So
Well, you're
just
still
a
getting
small
into the
clarification on
situation
that.
where you're having basically a lengthened biased concentric in terms of the resistance challenge, followed by basically an isometric catch, right? Basically a yielding isometric at the top into your into because you're not doing the concentric and then all of a sudden having something harder to push into. You're just having them squeeze at the top, right? So there's no resistance. It's not like you had a band or something on there that would be able to actually compensate for the momentum. So it's not the same. To me, it's like it's still a lengthened bias resistance challenge on that concentric. You're just now adding on top of that a yielding isometric for a fraction of a second on the top, similar to a catch, before you're going into the eccentric, right? So looking at what we have in terms of like, dynamic exercises versus isometric exercises, I wouldn't consider that yielding isometric at the top to be the same as if you were pushing into resistance, like an increasing or balanced level of resistance through it. Like if you had, say, an elastic or a dynamometer or some sort of resistance that was not subject to the momentum, right? So I just think that goes to point that we're even further away from the long versus short discussion, because the thrust isn't being done in a way that accentuates that short position with that tempo, if you're actually using in an explosive tempo per se, right?
Yeah, if we wanted to accentuate the shortened position, we would have done partials in that position.
Yeah, partials, or you could have done like a really slow tempo in the two exercises and to eliminate the factor of momentum. But then you're moving probably away from ecological validity, because most people don't do the thrust, slow, right?
We wanted the most ecologically valid question. So I think how we did things was probably the most in line with how typical people squat and typical people hip thrust. So that was essentially what we were going for. That's why we didn't standardized in the way that was really trying to isolate a specific question. We were like, all right, you deploy a whole bunch of individuals into the gym and tell them to squat or hip thrust, what would occur?
Yeah. So I guess the final thing I'll put on that point is, if we're talking about like range of motion partials in the thrust, that's a huge challenge, right? Because it's already a very small motion, right? And it's already a logistically challenging exercise to get in and out of and to load and et cetera, especially with its heavy and whatnot, right? I mean, it helps, if like, I guess you maybe it would be easier if you were to use one of the machine variations instead of the barbell variations. Like for doing the partials, that probably would be more feasible, and you could probably control the range of motion with some sort of apparatus or something like that. But from a resistance challenge perspective, it's almost like the thrust is somewhat of it's so much of a partial challenge, meaning that, like, okay, if we're using a thrust and tension, we're essentially biasing the majority of the mechanical tension to just the lengthened portion of that exercise, right? Versus doing it slow and not allowing the momentum and accentuating the top portion, right? So like in practice, when people want to accentuate the top, they go slower, they use a smaller range of motion, they pause at the top, or they'll do extra partials at the top, or they'll use bands. They have to do all of these things, that change the exercise in order to accentuate that short position, because otherwise the momentum is still like not really making that short position that the challenge.
Yeah. What that would do in terms of outcomes, I don't think is clear, but it is definitely different. That's obvious. Yeah, for sure.
I'm just saying it makes this comparison even further away from a short versus long muscle length comparison, because the resistance challenge is kind of towards the other side. And so if nobody has any other comments on the way that the thrust was performed, there's a ton of questions about how the squat was performed. So, I mean, do you just want to kind of summarize it really quick, and then I'll kind of pick from there?
Yeah, so I specifically left that out because I knew we'd have a whole conversation on that afterwards. So the squat was done, as I mentioned, to try to be as ecologically valid as possible. So how would they comfortably squat and reach as far down as they could? So there was, and I think we're going to change this for the paper, and that's why, like preprints, you sort of see how people interpret things and go from there. The testing was standardized to femur parallel to the floor. And the reason we did this and the reason I decided to do that was because in untrained individuals, they get more and more comfortable with getting lower and lower. So rather than like memorizing or taking a picture of that initial one and trying to standardize to where they got to the initial one, we just standardized the initial one. And then for training, we had them go as low as they comfortably could. And so with males included, which, some of them have more mobility restrictions than females, the overall, just so I could paint the picture, was that, and obviously it doesn't paint the whole picture because as we talked about, like femur parallel doesn't look the same in everybody and so on, but the majority of individuals were femur parallel to the floor, with 4 individuals of the 16 that were like clearly ass to grass. And if you look at where the bar position is, the moment arm was almost always in favor of the hip, not the knee. It was like fairly small. In one individual, it was a little bit longer. And this is obviously just visually. I didn't draw this on just yet, but it was pretty visually apparent that the bar position in relation to the distance from the hip and distance from the knee favored distance from the hip. I think I covered everything on that front, but I'm sure you guys will have some extra questions there. Oh, and just on that topic, because I want to increase transparency in research and actually know what the lifts look like, I want to, so instead of, we talked about stick figures, I think the best course of action is silhouettes, like just making the whole person black, and then you can see the barbell and see the girth of all of their limbs. So I just played around on Photoshop, and it looks pretty good, and you can see where everything is. So I'm thinking for either the next iteration of the preprint or the paper when we submit, we're going to include the squat silhouettes, so that way people have an understanding of what they actually did and what each one looked like. Oh, one individual. So I said one individual was very far from femur parallel. He was 6'9", and he was just like all legs. So it was very, very, very hard to get him into anything that resembled a femur parallel. So, and he grew a whole lot, by the way. So I don't think that he wasn't an outlier as it related to growth. So, but there was one individual that was pretty far, and we actually had to use the highest prong in the squat rack. If he was any taller, we would have had to create a specialized rig for him, because he was, and even with the highest prong, he was coming up like a decent amount. So yeah, it was bad.
I'm just glad he fit in the MRI.
Oh yeah, it was we were actually a little bit worried about what would happen in terms of whether we could get the quad in there. So yeah, it was pretty bad. At spotting, usually we'd have spotters, but he was so tall that like I just set up the safeties to be right where his bottom position was, because like just spotting was actually a nightmare. He was that tall. Yeah, I'm not a very tall individual for reference. I'm 5'9", so yeah, him being 6'9" did not make things easy on me.
For sure. I was briefly going to ask, so with the picture you're thinking of providing with the silhouette kind of blacked out a little bit,
yeah,
would that be one picture of one participant?
No, all participants.
Okay, so
yeah. So me and Kassem spoke about this previously. So I took a video of each person's squat in the middle of the study, so the middle session, and then I took a picture at their bottom position, and then I disregarded the video so that way I didn't have any sort of IRB issues. And then the bottom of that squat, I want to create that image of for every participant in the squat group. Yeah.
Cool. Question just between us now on the podcast. If you had to describe the average depth being reached by the participant in the squat group, how would you describe it? Like substantially below parallel, ass to grass, close to ass to grass on average? How would you describe it?
Yeah, so that's what I was referring to. I think the majority of individuals were at about parallel, with 4 individuals ass to grass, like super ass to grass, like obvious. It's hard because like as we talked about femur parallel, like a lot of them were like deep, but like if you just look at the femur alone, you're like, what's going on there. So my best characterization was that most were very close to at or below, while 4 were like super evidently like glute on hamstring situation.
Cool. Awesome. And by parallel, I'm guessing you're referring to powerlifting depth?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Cool, that makes sense. Yeah, no, just a quick question. Obviously, that helps with interpretation of the study because even just in comparing it to the previous study on the glutes by Kubo, it just helps to know what sort of depth we're talking about.
Yeah, I'm not sure that you can, as we mentioned, in terms of like make direct comparisons there, because it's like kind of very different, but it's good for context for sure. That's why I'm hoping to include them, and I hope to set the precedent of including the images so that way we can get an actual picture of what occurred.
For sure. And just for, I guess, context, so I've conducted one lower body range of motion study, and I'm currently conducting another one, the upper body. In that lower body one, I had all training performed on an IKD. So that was like literally controlled to the degree by the machine. So that was quite precise and quite straightforward. But then the upper body study is being performed in a very sort of, as you said, ecologically valid context. In that situation, what I did was provide participants with guide videos of what full range of motion and lengthened postures look like. So even though I won't be, able to take a picture of each participant doing each set, I'll at least be able to show what the guide videos were like, with the assumption that there's going to be some fluctuation around that. But yeah, like
assuming this is on unsupervised.
Correct.
You can. Okay,
That's correct. Yeah. But yeah, I think that your approach to reporting range of motion is really important, and in general, like getting some clarity on what was the actual range of motion being used is pretty important, even just for meta-analyzing down the line, right? Like if you want to extract the data from all the studies to see, okay, well, how much range of motion should we perform or what have you, it's super useful to have that data.
Yeah, and I think just transparency in general, like what was the machine, what was the range of motion, all that kind of stuff is just like really, really bad. And like I'm trying to find it's really hard to find and I'm going to butcher the name, but the Mayao studies, like the hamstring curl, what the actual machine was. I don't know if you guys have had any luck, but I have no idea what it actually is and what the machine's resistance profile is.
It would have been really nice to know if the resistance challenge was consistent across those two machines, right? So that's the one thing where, at least in the Pedrosa study, they were using the same leg extension or whatnot. But I would assume similar brand, that it was the same brand, so likely close. And the one of the reasons that I'm kind of confident that they were at least very close is that you had the reciprocal results in the opposing musculature, right? Like the hamstrings versus the sartorius, right? Where if one was an extremely lengthened bias resistance profile and the other was a short, I don't think we would have saw that nice, neat correlation between the opposing muscle groups.
Yep.
I feel like a study that consistent, and this is not at all an actual allegation, but it's either very indicative of an actual principle at play, or it's almost too good to be true. Like it's at that point, it's super consistent. Like, damn, it's amazing.
Yeah. I mean, if it was, they did a really good job, because like the difference between the gracilis and the sartorius was like dialed in, right? Because if you don't know your anatomy really well, you could easily assume that the gracilis does one thing or another, right? Because of where it attaches. So, so either really, really good, or somebody's also really, really good. So
if they're frauding, they're good at frauding.
Yeah. Okay. So a couple other things with the squat. We'll get into width and stuff as well. But we were talking briefly, and you kind of were giving me kind of a little bit of insights in terms of what you were seeing with the technique. And I think when it comes to the squat, I mean, you guys are young. I'm old. I've been coaching people as long as you guys have been alive, unfortunately. So almost like, I don't know that I've ever had a beginner come in and their quads were not the limiter in their squat, right? I've never had somebody come in and be like, oh man, they just have so much quads and not glutes, right? And you'd occasionally see that in like athletes or whatnot that just had a very, very quad dominant sport. Like sometimes I'd get a soccer player, right? Or football for you. But like, I think that's worth noting, that in an untrained population, the odds that the quads are not the limiter in their squat is going to be very, very small. And I think that brings into the question, like the muscle specific RIR difference between these two exercises, which was what kind of Milo was alluding at earlier. I think if anything, if I had to suspect like the mechanism that kind of like was the largest factor in this, that would have been kind of my guess, is that with the squat, you're just not taking the glutes to the same degree of failure that you can in a more isolated exercise. So when you are looking at technique, how often did you see that people were maybe kind of shifting their hips back over the course of the set, or on the concentric, you would see the hips kind of shoot back a little bit, or the butt rise a little bit faster? Like, was that fairly common across them, or?
Yeah, particularly in the individuals that were going very low, getting out of the hole was pretty much hips shooting back and then doing sort of what looked like a low bar squat. So I would say, yeah, you were saying something?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, so I would say the conjecture is probably true that the majority of individuals were limited by the quad. One individual who went very low was just like straight up and down, like crazy, but anomalous. Like, obviously it trained a whole bunch of individuals. You don't see that very often. One person who actually ended up in the hip thrust group was just an absolute freak. He was from Myanmar, and he could just squat ass to grass and just come straight back up. And his first time barbell squatting ever, he did 195 for 3, and it was just ridiculous form. Like, and that's the cool thing about research. You get to see like really cool anomalies. Like in a previous study I ran, this guy did 9. He was untrained too. By the end of the study, he had, I think it was 10 plates on the seated calf raise with one leg. So this was within subject design. So just freaky things you see in studies. But yeah, I agree with you in that the quad is generally a limiter in untrained individuals.
Yeah. So I think if anything, that would be what I would assume would have been like the strongest mechanism in play, is that, I mean, if you're looking at the context of, all right, well, the glutes were getting closer to physiological failure in the hip thrust, and that closer to failure is more effective, just simply by the notion of being closer to failure, then that kind of leans the study in favor towards the hip thrust. But if you think that training to failure is bullshit, and, you know, use your RIRs or whatever, it still would have been the relative volume for the glutes. Because if one exercise is basically taking a certain muscle to a given relative RIR more than the other, you're just essentially accumulating more rep volume, you know, relative between the exercises. So I would think that was probably the main limiter for the squat in terms of it being a glute exercise. And I think, you know, that just kind of fits in. Like, I think if people are looking at this as just like, what's the best glute exercise? Is it squats or hip thrust? Then I think that's a very poor way to look at this study, because I wouldn't, like, even though some people love the squat and I just want to assume it's the best, it's the king or the queen of lower body exercises and does all those things. Like, I look at the squat as like a very kind of like Swiss Army knife. It's a pretty good lower body exercise, but, you know, would I choose a nice, well-designed hack squat or a pendulum squat, you know, over a squat for quads? Of course I would, right? Especially in an untrained, you know, population, right? Would I choose a like foot high or multi-hip type exercise to challenge the lengthened portion of the glutes versus, or, you know, or even like a stabilized split squat, drop lunge type thing or whatnot? I would still consider probably a better glute, because you're removing the other muscles from being as much of a limiter, you know, in those exercises versus a squat. So I think a squat is a great exercise to train the overall lower body in as few sets as possible. But I don't think you should look at this as a battle between like, what's the best glute exercise. And so if people are looking to like say, well, look at this, like the hip thrust is now the king of all exercises and long muscle lengths don't matter. I think that's where I don't want to see people run with this. I think that at the same time, people that have been hating on the hip thrust and being like, oh, it's a short position exercise, or, you know, whatever sort of ad hominem insult that goes along with your masculinity or whatever, because you do a hip thrust or whatever, like, I don't think that's valid ever. I mean, it's a very specific movement, and it very easily puts the hip extensors as the limiter of the exercise. So it has a lot of things going for it, even though it actually, isn't on the longer muscle length. And I think, Milo and I are actually working on a guide for, training it, doing lengthened bias training. And that doesn't excuse you from thinking about all of the other confounders and variables that make an exercise a good exercise, whether that be like the stability and coordination demand, whether it be how isolated it is for that muscle and how, much that muscle is likely to be the limiter. I think we still have to take all of those things into account and then apply muscle length over that. So knowing what we know about the effect size for muscle length, right? I would assume that the relative volume difference between these exercises would have probably overcome the difference in muscle length if we were kind of comparing those. Like, I mean, I don't know if you would agree with that, Milo, but that I think basically the limitations of the squat would exceed the muscle length, especially because we're not getting extremely to that length, and we are a little bit throttled in terms of how much tension we can make at that length in this exercise.
No, I agree for sure. And that's the reason I don't view the study as and it's not supposed to be. But I think if people run with the idea that it's supposed to be a comparison of longer versus shorter muscle length training for the glutes, then you get into a pretty weird place because of the limitations that we mentioned. But if you view the study as what it is, which is a study on the hip thrust as a means to grow your glutes as compared to the squat exercise, as a sort of very practical thing that people usually think about when they're programming, it's like, oh, I want to train my glutes, I want to grow my glutes, should I do squats or hip thrusts? If you view it as a study that's answering that question, more power to you. I think this is a really good study to view in that context. But I think if you're looking at the study at the idea of is longer or shorter muscle length training better for the glutes, that's not where the study is going to have the most use necessarily.
Yeah, I think I agree with the overall sentiment. I think there might be some, shifting of where I would place more, stock. So like amount of reps away from failure in the glute versus the quad. We might have, slight differences in how we think about those things. But I think overall, it's definitely not addressing the length question directly. And I think one thing that's super important to point out, and I think I mentioned this, is that if you're trying to get isolated glute growth, you now have an exercise that does this. And I think that's a non-negligible amount of people who are trying to limit thigh hypertrophy and increase glute hypertrophy. So I think it's helpful to know that.
Yeah, interestingly, as popular as this is, this study doesn't change literally anything for me in my approach, and that hey, yeah, thrusts, bridges, kickbacks, all of those things, they're very specific. And that's, I think, where the real value of those comes in is hey, I want a very targeted exercise, and these are very good ways of being able to do that. In general, especially for the hip, it's easier to bias a muscle's function in a shorter position, because in the lengthened position, things just become more mechanically redundant, which is good for us, from a functional evolutionary standpoint. If we're getting taken to the end range of a joint, we want to be able to come out of that position and not get crumpled up like a taco. But from a, precision bodybuilding standpoint, that does kind of impose, some limitations in terms of choosing where that stimulus is going when we get into some of those. It doesn't mean it's not possible. It's just a little bit more challenging. Obviously, the squat is going to be an exercise with a ton of variables, which actually takes me kind of into my next questions, which are going to be on the squat, but also I'm going to try and play the devil's advocate and challenge you as much on the conflict of interest points and stuff. So in terms of the study design, right, how, you chose this, you ended up choosing the squat because that seemed like an important thing. That was the main thing. This is basically, it's you wanted to give the Barbalho Study, a little bit of a spanking and put out a new one, right? And to be this is how you do it. This is a proper one. And now we have basically, direct evidence that we can be confident in. And kudos, I think you guys delivered on that. Now, in terms of the way that you did the squat and how you're reporting that and stuff, what influence was there on the study design, from any of the people that were, involved in financing the study or pushing it?
Yeah. So we all agreed that because of the Kubo, we discussed the Kubo study a decent amount, and we weren't very sure how to interpret it because of all the angle issues. So we agreed that the lower the better. But since we were including males, and since we were trying to be as ecologically valid as possible, while also considering the fact that we were crunched for time to some extent, so you'd have to exclude a whole bunch of individuals who couldn't reach depth, we decided that the most economical approach from a time aspect and in terms of ecological validity, that was a good choice. And to Milo's point and your point, I think the sort of macho kind of which exercise is better doesn't really lend itself to this very specific way of squatting is better and so on. It's like the squat is better, and you have someone squat to depth, and usually people consider depth to be, like a powerlifting style depth versus a hip thrust. The squat will come out on top, or the hip thrust will come out on top, depending on which camp you're in and which mechanisms you decided to use on that particular day. So we decided to answer the more popular question rather than attempting to sort of isolate variables, because that's, I think, what more people in the general population cared about. But I don't think that they had really strong opinions either way. I think especially in untrained individuals, which I think there's a whole bunch of upside to untrained individuals, standardizing any sort of squat mechanic would have been really, really hard to do. Like getting them to just squat appropriately and not look wonky, take some time. Having them do very, very, very specific things when they're just learning the movement is an uphill battle.
Maybe for the funding for these studies, part of it should be sending you guys out to an N1 education seminar so we could make you guys squat masters.
Oh, wow. That was a shot. Wow. You saw this? You saw that, Milo? Yeah. I mean, their squats look good. I will say it was very, like their squats and hip thrusts look good. Like I feel very confident in saying that. Like many people just walking by, seeing them train, like I'm very happy with what they looked like in both exercises.
Okay, so one of the reasons that I asked that, and I want to know what influence they had on, like, okay, because your squat width was between 1 and 1.5 times shoulder width, I believe it was, or hip. I can't remember if it was shoulder or hip width, or whatnot. And he did the same thing for the hip thrust, right?
Yeah.
And there were no and then no specific guidelines, right? So I'm just gonna, this is again, I promised you that I would take the role to satisfy like all of the haters. So I'm just going to go ahead and read this quote here from a critique Brett did of the Kubo study, and it says, and I quote, "And herein lies the problem with modern research. Our methods haven't evolved with technology. Why and how articles get published without pictures or supplementary video clips blows my mind. I understand the need for text only in the 1800s, but it's the 2020s. We should never be left guessing as to what the subject's form was like during the experiment. I'm certainly not trying to cast doubt on the Kubo experiment. It's an excellent paper. I'd just like to see researchers be more thorough as it pertains to the exercise form description. For example, describing squat depth purely on knee angle doesn't cut it, in my opinion." This is from a contribution that he did to Bill Campbell's what is the Body by Science review, for anybody that is wondering where that is coming from. But I pretty much agree with everything that Brett said there, right? Like I absolutely agree with that. Which is why I was curious when I saw your paper. I was like, I feel like he would have like wanted to push more for those things, and I didn't know if there was an influence one direction or the other, because I would think that if you wanted to, if I were, in the hip thrust business, I would want to make the most bulletproof argument possible that, look, the hip thrust beat out the most gluteus, hippiest squat that you guys could come up with, and there could be no doubts left. Like, I want you to know what the range of motion was, what the hip angle was, what the technique. I want you to see this so that basically, because you have, like with every squat study, this is kind of what ends up as like, well, what does it look like, right? And I pretty much agree with that, because the squat is an exercise where there's a tremendous amount of variation. It's not like we're measuring elbow flexion or knee extension or something where it's like, okay, this is very easy to standardize. I mean, how much can you mess up, knee extension, I've seen people try, but for the most part, now with the squat, there's tons and tons of ways to have, one, you have individual structural variations, but also just a person's, technique and intent. If one person thinks that they should be pushing their knees forward, another person thinks that their hips are back, and how they need, so to me, it's like, well, for an exercise like this, that's actually where probably the most coaching intervention should be. Like now, if from an ecological standpoint, you're just gonna be like, hey, if these people just squat and that's what you want to do, that's fine. But to me, then that doesn't answer the question of like, well, it's the hip thrust, by the nature that it's more constrained, is a more controlled exercise versus now you have a other exercise that is much more randomized in terms of its technique and how it would apply to the individual. So my question is, one, was there any influence either way on the technique or what was going to be recorded and reported versus not? Was there a push in either direction? Because to me, it's like, I think you could get the same critiques of like, well, what did these squats look like? Obviously, this conversation is going to bring a lot more of that to light, right? But I think for people just reading the paper, that's, you've seen a lot of the questions, and I did a poll, and that's what a lot of the questions are. I was like, well, what did these look like? And what would have happened if they did this and this and this, in terms of like, well, what would have happened if they, went to, full hip flexion? What would have happened if they were cued to have their butts go back? What would have happened if they would have used a narrower stance, which would align more with the glutes and less with the vertical fibers of the adductor magnus, right? Like those were all like, well, what ifs, right? And so I'm just curious if there was any, suggestions or influence either direction.
Yeah. So to Brett's credit, actually, we had the RDL set, and because it was more of a popular, like Brad had a very, I actually messaged him. I was like, why? I think the more popular question and addressing the Barbalho study was more front of mind there. So Brett was very happy with the RDL to his credit. And so I think that's an important point. I think the other thing is that I think you can make a decent argument for all of those iterations, but the problem is you can't do 100 studies. You can only do one study. So if their feet were wider in the hip thrust, if they went slower, if they did partials at the end, you can make a hip thrust, be a ton of different ways, just like you can make the squat be a ton of different ways. Because we had untrained individuals, the simple answer is that we wanted them to squat in the way that was most comfortable for them, and we figured that it would end up being a slightly more hingy squat because of the reasons that we mentioned earlier, that the quads were going to be limiters. So even if you had them squat deep, they would end up being more hingy anyways. If you made it a low bar, then why not do the RDL? Like why do the low bar in the first place? Make more constraints for the upper body. Like if we wanted it to be a squat versus a hip thrust question, then I think the way we did it and making it more ecologically valid answers that question slightly better. If we standardize things like hip back and stuff like that, I would have much preferred an RDL and stuck with that. So I think that's the main reason.
So real quick, I actually had a conversation with Brad earlier about the initial choice of, because he actually said, oh, the next study I want to see is like RDL versus hip thrust.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it does have the same potential limitation of like the hamstring giving out before the glute will. Now the glute can probably take over to an extent. But I do think like there's a lot of synergist muscle groups that may give before that one does. And obviously if they're performing a similar function, it's less of an issue. So I would see the RDL working better as a comparison. But yeah, like I think if you were simply trying to look at, like in this case, it sounds like you were trying to draw a comparison between the RDL and the hip thrust within most programming. Again, not a comparison of long or extra short muscle extension, which is fine. But yeah.
Yeah, so the only reason we're it's like two popular compounds as opposed to really, really isolating the question. So with multi-hip, you could take out the hamstring to a large extent. But with the RDL, you couldn't. You wouldn't be doing anything with the adductor magnus involvement, but I think it's a much more specific question in that case. So yeah, I agree that RDL isn't even the best way to isolate the question. Yeah.
Thank you for joining us on part 1 of this discussion of the current glute science and a deeper look at the squat versus the hip thrust study. We'll be back for part 2, so make sure you like, subscribe, and leave a review for the N1 Experience, and we'll see you in the next episode.